What was it like to operate a spacecraft using the technologies of the 1960s? What price did humanity pay for the moon? All of this can be understood from the story of Neil Armstrong, who was the first person on the moon. Today, I will tell you about this amazing astronaut and his journey to the moon. And at the end, I'll discuss why humanity is returning to the moon. Neil Alden Armstrong was born on August 5, 1930, to Stephen Armstrong in Ohio, USA. Neil's father was a regular auditor, while his mother managed the household. Neil was not the only child in the family. He had two brothers and a younger sister. Interestingly, Neil was fascinated by aviation and space from childhood. His first flight on an airplane occurred when he was just 6 years old. As a 16-year-old teenager, Armstrong obtained his first pilot certificate, even before getting his driver's license. He later received a test pilot certificate, among others. He began his career at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, as an engineer and test pilot. In his famous speech to Congress on May 25, 1961, John Kennedy set the nation the task of sending a man to the moon before the end of the decade. The first phase of the Lunar Program was named Apollo 1. During ground tests, a fire broke out in the spacecraft's cabin, killing the entire crew on January 27, 1967. NASA drew conclusions and made several improvements to the spacecraft design and safety. The failed launch was declared a day of tragedy. In fact, there were launches earlier. The name Apollo 1 was retrospectively assigned after the fire. The next launch in the Apollo program was officially named Apollo 4. There were many intermediate flights and checks, so if you want to see a complete table of flights, check Wikipedia. The second phase, Apollo 7, took place in October 1968, and this time it was successful. The spacecraft completed 163 orbits around the Earth in 10 days, and for the first time, among others, was piloted by a human. The third phase, Apollo 8, was not just a manned flight, but a full flight to the moon. It took place in December of that year. The spacecraft completed 10 orbits around the moon and then successfully returned to Earth. Understandably, this was a first in world history. In March 1969, the fourth phase, Apollo 9, was conducted to test the lunar module's operation, separate from the spacecraft. It was to land on the moon and take off back. The final rehearsal before the lunar landing was the fifth stage, named Apollo 10, which took place in May 1969. The crew made 31 orbits around the moon and lowered the lunar module to an altitude of 15 kilometers above the lunar surface, but did not land. The sixth phase entered history as Apollo 11. In September 1962, NASA selected Neil Armstrong as part of a new group of astronauts. For participation in the US Lunar Program, the best of the best were selected: experienced pilots, engineers, scientists, physically and psychologically healthy individuals. Neil Armstrong was one of them. He had over 2,000 flight hours in different types of aircraft, including supersonic and hypersonic. He also had experience working at NASA as a test pilot and engineer. He participated in the Gemini program, which was a precursor to the Apollo program. Before this, Neil had already completed the Gemini 8 spaceflight in 1966, where he docked 2 spacecraft in orbit. However, he also encountered a serious malfunction that nearly led to a disaster. He managed to regain control of the spacecraft and safely returned to Earth. To prepare for the lunar landing, Neil Armstrong and his partner Edwin Aldrin spent many hours in simulators that mimicked moon conditions. They also studied maps and photographs of the lunar surface to select an optimal landing site. Of course, they studied scientific aspects of the lunar expedition, such as geology, astronomy, biology, and physics. The spacecraft launched on July 16, 1969 at 13:32 Eastern Time from Kennedy Space Center in Florida, USA. The spacecraft consisted of 2 parts, the command module Columbia and the lunar module Eagle. On board were 3 astronauts: Edwin Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, Michael Collins, the command module pilot, the one to remain in orbit, and the mission commander, Neil Armstrong. The launch was carried out on a Saturn V rocket. The journey to the moon lasted about 3 days, during which the astronauts checked the ship's systems, communicated with Earth, etc. If lay people think such flights are made in a straight line, they are mistaken. In reality, complex ballistic trajectories are calculated for such flights to minimize fuel consumption through gravitational maneuvers around the planet. This is why the duration of the flight there differed from the return journey. On July 19, 1969, at 17:21, the spacecraft reached the Moon and entered its orbit. It made 30 orbits around the Moon, during which the astronauts studied the lunar surface and selected a landing site. On July 20, 1969, at 13:46, 2 crew members transferred to the lunar module and undocked from the command module, leaving the third, Michael Collins, in orbit. They began their descent to the Moon, which was full of difficulties and dangers. The team faced problems with navigation, communication, fuel, and the computer. They also discovered that the initially chosen landing site was too rocky and unsuitable. Neil Armstrong decided to switch to manual control and look for another landing spot. The astronauts found a smooth area in the Sea of Tranquility and gently landed the lunar module on it at 2017. Neil noticed that a layer of lunar dust was moving under the spacecraft, stirred up by the jet stream directly from the engine nozzles. As the craft descended below 30 meters, visibility worsened. According to Neil's account, we started to raise dust, and it wasn't usual dust clouds like on Earth. The dust above the lunar surface formed a cover that moved in all directions away from the lunar module. This veil of moving dust almost completely obscured the surface, although some particularly large rocks protruded above it. This very fast, almost horizontal flow of dust didn't rise in clouds. It simply flew away from us in all directions like a flat radial layer. As the descent continued, visibility became increasingly worse. Neil visually assessed the ship's altitude quite well despite the dust. However, due to the dust, it was difficult for the astronauts to estimate their longitudinal and lateral horizontal speed. The only saving grace was the large hills and rocks protruding above the layer of moving dust. They had to peer intently above, looking for visual clues. With today's technology, this would be much easier with special instruments and cameras that see through dust. But back then, they had to rely on intuition and personal professionalism. It was incredibly difficult. Then Aldrin said, "And then, when I was over the landing point, all that was needed was to relatively slowly lower the lunar module down, keeping it from noticeable drift forward or sideways. At 49 feet, I figured we'd made it, even though we were running low on fuel. It seemed to me that the craft could withstand a fall from that height thanks to the deformable foam shock absorbers in the landing struts. Not that I wanted to drop it from that height, but now, below 49 feet, I was confident everything was in order." Neil radioed, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." This was the first human landing on the Moon in human history. On July 21, 1969, at 2:56, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch of the lunar module and descended the ladder to the lunar surface. He became the first person to set foot on the Moon, and the fact that Aldrin landed with him doesn't matter historically. He will still be considered number 2, all the laurels to number 1. Such injustice is there in sports, where the second number can be laid by a fraction of a second, and in science, nothing can be done about it. Armstrong placed his left boot on the lunar soil and uttered the famous words, "This is one small step for a man, but a giant leap for mankind." 19 minutes after Armstrong, his partner stepped onto the Moon. The team planted the American flag on the Moon and left a commemorative plaque with the astronaut signatures and the signature of US President Richard Nixon. Kennedy didn't live to see this moment. They also left a metal disc with messages from 73 countries. For whom? Probably for future generations, hardly for aliens. What do you think? Write your opinion in the comments. Although rumors about aliens living on the far side of the Moon still exist, and yet there are enough images of the far side of the Moon today, and many unmanned spacecraft have descended there. Neil and Edwin collected several samples of lunar soil and rocks. Aldrin also took several photographs of Neil Armstrong on the Moon. They described how unusual it was to feel the Moon's low gravity, which allowed them to jump and run on the surface of Earth's satellite. His partner Edwin Aldrin described in his book how strange it was to feel the silence and solitude that reigned on the Moon. But at the same time, they felt pride and happiness for their achievement. They said that when you are physically so far away from home, you are overwhelmed with indescribable love for your home planet shining in the sky. These were the first people to see Earth from the Moon. At 17:54, they returned to the lunar module Eagle and closed the hatch behind them. Neil and Edwin prepared to take off from the Moon and reunite with Michael Collins in orbit. On July 21st at 13:54, the craft took off from the Moon and successfully docked with the command module Columbia. Now the entire team of heroes was ready to return to Earth. On July 22, 1969, at 16:55, the astronauts left the Moon's orbit and headed towards Earth. The return flight to Earth was a day shorter and lasted about 2 days, during which the astronauts checked the ship's systems, communicated with Earth, and rested. On July 24, 1969, at 16:50 Eastern Time, the spacecraft entered Earth's atmosphere, overcoming strong friction and heating. At 16:51, the craft deployed parachutes and reduced speed. At 16:52, it made a soft landing in the Pacific Ocean, 930 miles from the Hawaiian Islands. The astronauts were greeted and brought aboard the aircraft carrier Hornet, where NASA representatives, US President Richard Nixon, and journalists awaited them. Apollo 11's lunar landing elicited awe and admiration from millions worldwide who followed the mission on television and radio. Like Yuri Gagarin, the first person to fly in space, the astronauts also made numerous trips and visits worldwide, meeting leaders, scientists, celebrities, and ordinary people. However, after the moon flight, life goes on, and the astronaut faces a choice: to rest on his laurels or do something else. In the 1970s, Neil Armstrong decided to continue his career in the engineering and machinery fields. Armstrong's main contribution at NASA was supporting the new technology of electronic remote flight control. At that time, he was already the deputy chief of the aeronautics department. Armstrong endorsed the idea of a digital electronic flight stabilization system, DFBW, rejecting the proposal to fund an analog system. Engineers at the Flight Research Center sincerely believed that the quality of digital computers was unsuitable for flights. "I just flew to the moon and back on one of them," Armstrong said. With these words, he virtually embarrassed the engineers at the Flight Research Center. They admitted they had not even thought of such a possibility. This technology was applied in developing the new control system for the F-8C Crusader aircraft. The US Lunar Program did not end after Apollo 11. It continued until 1972, when the last manned flight to the Moon, Apollo 17, took place. In total, there were 6 lunar landings, involving 12 people. Altogether, they spent about 80 hours on the Moon and collected approximately 837 pounds of lunar samples. The astronauts installed various scientific equipment on the Moon, allowing for the study of the Moon and space from Earth. This included a corner reflector for measuring the distance from Earth to the Moon with a laser. The US Lunar Program was discontinued due to high costs, low public interest, and political reasons. NASA started talking about the Moon again after China discovered helium-3 there. This is the ideal fuel for nuclear fusion. There is every reason to believe that this could revolutionize energy. After all, nuclear fusion is much more efficient than atomic energy and cleaner in terms of ecology. In essence, the lunar race has already begun between 3 countries: the USA, China, and India. Russia also states its plans, but has so far been suffering failure after failure. Currently, helium-3 is not extracted from natural sources on Earth, as it makes no sense. Earth's atmosphere contains only 0.000137% of this substance. According to various expert estimates, the content of helium-3 in lunar soil could be from 1.1 to 5.5 billion pounds. This would suffice for 5,000 years of energy needs for the entire Earth's population. And considering that the population will start to decrease from the 2060s, it might last even longer. And this is only on nuclear fusion. After all, there are other ways to generate energy, and they're evolving. Experts believe that helium-3 and its decay products are absolutely harmless to the environment compared to contemporary nuclear fuel. We will hear more about the Moon, and lunar bases may well transition from the realm of science fiction into everyday reality. That's all for now. Bye-bye.